In the heart of a forgotten town, where the trees grew too tall and the shadows seemed to breathe, there stood a church. Its spire pierced the heavens, black against a sky that never seemed fully alive, always overcast, always churning with gray clouds that hung too low. The townsfolk whispered about it, though only in hushed tones, as if the very walls of their homes had ears. No one dared to approach it, not even in the light of day. The building loomed like a malignant tumor, its stone walls slick with moisture, veins of dark ivy snaking across them like black arteries. The locals called it the Church of the Soulless. Nobody knew exactly when it had been built. Some said it had always been there, older than the town itself, older than the forest that surrounded it. Others claimed it appeared one night long ago, materializing under a blood-red moon, its bell tolling a haunting melody that echoed for miles. But no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave until the night of the first scream. It came on a cold autumn evening when the wind carried the scent of decayed leaves and something metallic. A woman named Clara, the town seamstress, had been returning home late from her shop. Her candle flickered weakly as she passed the church. She hurried her steps, clutching her shawl tighter, when the sound froze her in place. A scream, not human, not entirely, ripped through the air, so raw and primal that her candle went out as if snuffed by the sheer force of it. She turned toward the church, her heart hammering. The scream came again, and this time, she swore she saw movement in the church's broken stained glass windows. A shadow, hunched and writhing, as though something or someone was clawing at the glass from the inside. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Then, the church bell rang. It was a slow, deliberate chime, deep and resonant, vibrating through the earth beneath her feet. It shouldn't have rung. The bell tower had been silent for decades, its mechanisms rusted and broken, or so the townsfolk believed. But now, with each tool, Clara felt something cold creep into her chest. The sound wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her, resonating in her bones, her blood, her soul. The next morning, Clara was gone. Her door was wide open, her belongings undisturbed, but her shawl lay crumpled on the dirt road leading toward the church. The townspeople gathered, whispering and shuffling nervously. Some said they should go after her. Others shook their heads, their faces pale, and murmured of the soulless, the ones who answered the church's call. Days turned into weeks, and more people began to disappear. Each time, the pattern was the same: a scream in the dead of night, the tolling of the bell, and then silence. Those brave, or foolish, enough to look for the missing reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees around the church, shapes that seemed to twist and writhe when stared at too long. The air around the church grew heavier, suffocating. Animals refused to go near it, their howls and screeches filling the nights as if warning the humans to stay away. And yet, the church seemed to pulse with life, or something like it. Flickering lights could be seen inside its windows, and strange, guttural chanting would echo faintly through the town on moonless nights. The mayor, a man named Elias who prided himself on being rational, decided he'd had enough. "It's just an old building," he declared one evening at the town hall. "We'll investigate it, find out what's happening, and put an end to this madness." Elias led a group of men to the church the following night. They carried lanterns, ropes, and axes, their faces pale but determined. The townsfolk gathered to watch them leave, holding their breath as they disappeared into the mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. Hours passed. The mist thickened, and then, from the direction of the church, the screaming began. Not one scream, many, twisting together, rising and falling like a grotesque symphony of agony. The townsfolk bolted their doors and windows, clutching their loved ones and praying the sound wouldn't find its way into their homes. The screaming went on until dawn, when it finally fell silent. Elias and his men never returned. When the townsfolk finally ventured toward the church, all they found was a trail of bloody handprints leading up to its heavy, iron-bound doors. The doors, once sealed shut, now stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. From within came a low, wet sound like something breathing too heavily, too deeply. No one dared to step inside, but the church wasn't done. For days after Elias and his men vanished, the town was gripped by an unnatural stillness. The air was thick, damp, and smelled faintly of iron, as though the town itself was bleeding. The sound of the church bell no longer tolled, but an oppressive silence replaced it, a quiet so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. The doors of the church remained ajar. The townsfolk avoided even looking in its direction, their eyes drawn instinctively to the ground whenever they passed near it. Yet, the longer the doors remained open, the more the tension in the town grew. It was as if the church were exhaling some malevolent force, spilling it into the streets like invisible fog. Strange things began to happen. Birds, once absent from the area, returned in flocks, but they were wrong. Their feathers were patchy, their beaks blood-stained, and their hollow, glassy eyes watched the townsfolk too intently. Cats, once so common in the streets, vanished entirely. At night, those brave enough to glance out their windows swore they saw pale figures wandering toward the church, their movements stiff, as though their limbs were being dragged by invisible strings. And then came the voices. At first, they were faint, whispers riding the wind that could easily be mistaken for the creak of old wood or the rustling of leaves. But as days passed, the whispers grew louder. They sounded like many voices speaking at once, overlapping in a maddening cacophony of pleas, laughter, and guttural growls. Worse, the voices knew the names of those who heard them. Clara, one old man swore he heard from the shadows outside his home. He'd been Clara's neighbor, and the sound of her voice calling his name nearly drove him to madness. When he opened his door to look for her, he found only deep, bloody scratches along the wood, as though something with claws had tried to force its way in. By the third week, the town was unraveling. People locked themselves in their homes, avoiding the streets entirely. Some families simply packed their belongings and fled, though the older residents warned them it was futile. The church doesn't let go, they said. It pulls you back, one way or another. But there was a woman who refused to run. Her name was Marta, the town's herbalist. Widowed and childless, Marta had lived on the outskirts of town for as long as anyone could remember. She was practical, unflinching, and the only person who had ever dared to confront the church. Years ago, she'd lost her husband to its call. She had never forgiven it. "I won't sit and wait for that thing to take the rest of us," she announced one gray morning, standing in the town square with a lantern in one hand and a rusted machete in the other. Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "This town has suffered long enough. I'm going in there, and I'm ending this." "Don't be a fool," one of the townsfolk said, clutching a rosary in trembling hands. "You'll only disappear like the rest." "Maybe," Marta replied, her lips thinning into a grim line. "But if I don't, it'll keep taking us one by one. Someone has to do something." No one volunteered to join her. They only watched in silence as she lit her lantern and walked toward the church, her machete glinting in the weak light. As she approached, the air grew colder. Her breath came in visible puffs, and the lantern's flames sputtered, as though reluctant to burn. The open doors yawned before her like the mouth of some enormous beast, and from within came that wet, heavy breathing she had heard whispered about in town. Marta hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The church swallowed her whole. Inside, the air was thick and damp, reeking of rot and something far worse, something acrid and metallic that burned her nostrils. The faint light from her lantern revealed that the church's interior was nothing like the crumbling stone exterior. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of long, blackened tables. On each table lay what Marta could only describe as offerings. Human bones, stripped clean of flesh, arranged in grotesque patterns. Glass jars filled with murky liquids lined the walls, and inside them floated things Marta couldn't bring herself to name. The walls of the church writhed as if alive, the ivy growing inside pulsating like veins. The stained glass windows no longer depicted saints or angels. Instead, they showed twisted, inhuman figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their hands reaching out as if begging for release or dragging something unseen closer. "Who's there?" Marta called, her voice sharp and defiant, though her hands trembled around the machete's hilt. The breathing grew louder, wet, rhythmic. From the far end of the church, a figure emerged. At first, it looked human, but as it stepped into the light of Marta's lantern, she realized how wrong she was. The creature was tall and impossibly thin, its skin stretched tightly over a frame that didn't seem entirely human. Its head was elongated, its mouth a vertical slit filled with rows of jagged teeth that clicked together as it moved. Its eyes, black, endless voids, fixed on her, and Marta felt her knees weaken. "Why do you come here?" the creature rasped, its voice like wind dragging over broken glass. "You who cling to a soul, I've come to end you," Marta said, though her voice cracked. The creature tilted its head, a sound like bone snapping echoing through the church. "In me," it repeated, and its laughter was a chorus, many voices spilling from one mouth. "You cannot end what has no end. You cannot destroy what has already devoured eternity." It lunged. The creature's lunge wasn't immediate. It unfurled itself slowly, like a spider stalking prey caught in its web. Its jagged teeth parted slightly as a sound emerged, a low, guttural hum that resonated with something deep in Marta's chest, making her vision blur for a moment. Her hands gripped the machete tighter, though her palms were slick with sweat. As it advanced, Marta took a shaky step back, swinging the lantern toward the figure. The light wavered across its form, revealing details that twisted her stomach. Its arms were too long, jointed in unnatural places, the skin stretched tight over sharp bone ridges. Veins pulsed with a black, tar-like substance that seemed to move on its own beneath its translucent flesh. It was wrong in every way, an affront to existence itself. And yet it smiled. The thing didn't stop moving as it spoke. Its voice echoed off the walls, each syllable layered with dozens of whispers. "You reek of defiance," it said, its elongated head tilting with an almost curious air. "But beneath it, I smell your fear." Marta steadied herself, forcing her legs not to buckle. "You'll smell your own blood if you take another step," she spat, though her voice wavered. She swung the machete in a wide arc, the blade whistling through the air. The creature stopped, as if considering her words. Then it laughed, an awful, wet sound that rippled through the room like a wave. The walls seemed to respond, the blackened ivy writhing as if alive. "Blood," it echoed. "Blood is the ink with which I write eternity." Before Marta could blink, it moved. The thing's speed was unnatural, a blur of jagged limbs and snapping teeth. Marta barely managed to stumble backward, the machete slicing through empty air. The lantern clattered to the floor, its flames sputtering but mercifully staying lit. The creature loomed over her now, its breath hot and rancid, its void-like eyes boring into hers. "I have seen the end of all things," it hissed, leaning closer. "And you will join it." Marta didn't hesitate. Summoning every ounce of courage, she swung the machete upward, the blade biting deep into the creature's arm. It shrieked, a high-pitched, unnatural wail that made Marta's ears ring. Black choir sprayed from the wound, sizzling as it hit the stone floor. The creature staggered back, its gaze fixed on her, now filled with something she hadn't expected: amusement. It lifted its injured arm, the wound already knitting itself back together. "Ah," it purred, its voice dripping with mockery. "You are persistent. I do enjoy that in a meal." The walls began to pulse more violently now, the symbols etched into the stone glowing faintly with a sickly green light. From the shadows, other figures began to emerge. At first, Marta thought they were more of the creatures, but as they stepped into the flickering light of the fallen lantern, her heart sank. They were people, or what was left of them. The first was Elias. His face was a pale, bloated mask of terror, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His hands twitched unnaturally at his sides, as though strings were pulling them. Behind him came the others, men, women, even children, their bodies twisted and broken, their movements jerky and wrong. They were the missing townsfolk. "Do you see them?" the creature asked, its voice a honeyed whisper. "The soulless. They have no pain, no fear, no burden of choice. They are free. They're dead," Marta said through gritted teeth, though her voice faltered as Elias took a shuddering step toward her. His mouth opened, and a low, mournful groan spilled out. "Death is such a small thing," the creature said. "What I offer is greater." Marta backed away, her hands trembling. The machete felt useless in her grip, a pitiful weapon against the sheer wrongness of what she faced. Her mind raced, desperate for a plan. She glanced around the church, searching for anything that could give her an advantage. Her eyes landed on the altar. It was massive, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, similar to those glowing on the walls. At its center was a basin filled with the same black choir that flowed through the creature's veins. "Everything begins here," the creature said, noticing her gaze. "The altar is my heart, my anchor. It binds this place to me, and me to this world." Marta's breath caught. That was it. Before she could second-guess herself, she lunged toward the altar. The creature roared, a sound that shook the very foundation of the church. The soulless surged forward, their movements frantic, their eyes fixed on her with a desperate hunger. Marta swung the machete wildly, carving a path through the shambling figures. Their flesh was soft, decayed, but their numbers were overwhelming. She reached the altar, her chest heaving, and plunged the machete into the basin of choir. The blade sank deep, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to quake. The choir bubbled violently, spilling over the edges of the basin. The creature screamed, its voice a deafening howl of rage and pain. "You dare!" it shrieked, its form convulsing. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand." But Marta didn't stop. She grabbed the lantern from the floor, its flame still flickering weakly, and hurled it onto the altar. The oil caught instantly, flames erupting in a blaze of orange and blue. The choir ignited, the fire spreading unnaturally fast, racing up the walls and along the veins of ivy. The creature howled, its body writhing as the flames consumed the church. The soulless shrieked in unison, their forms collapsing into heaps of ash. Marta stumbled backward, shielding her face from the heat. "You think this is victory?" the creature snarled, its voice echoing even as its body began to disintegrate. "You have only opened the door wider." With a final, guttural roar, the creature collapsed into itself, leaving behind nothing but a gaping void of darkness. The church trembled, its walls cracking and crumbling as the fire spread. Marta turned and ran, her legs screaming in protest as she burst through the doors and into the cold night air. Behind her, the church collapsed in on itself, the flames devouring everything until nothing remained but a smoldering crater. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in weeks, the town felt still. But as Marta stood there, her heart pounding, she couldn't shake the creature's final words. She had won, hadn't she? Marta stood at the edge of the smoldering crater, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The night air was still cold, but it lacked the cloying, oppressive weight it had carried for weeks. The church was gone, consumed by flames and darkness, and yet she felt no relief. The creature's final words echoed in her mind, as chilling as the night itself. Asterisk, you have only opened the door wider. Asterisk, the townsfolk had gathered behind her, hesitant to approach. They lingered in the shadows, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the spot where the church had once loomed. Marta turned to face them, clutching the bloodied machete in her trembling hand. "It's done," she said, though the words felt hollow. "The church is gone. Whatever was inside, it's over." No one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and uneasy. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry. The sound was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife. The mother hushed her quickly, glancing around nervously, as though afraid the sound might awaken something. Marta's gaze swept over the gathered faces. Some looked relieved, others skeptical, but most were simply blank, empty in a way that made her stomach twist. It was as if the fear had drained something vital from them, leaving behind husks of the people they once were. But it was over, wasn't it? The days that followed were eerily quiet. The townsfolk began to pick up the pieces of their lives, but an unshakable sense of unease lingered. The crater where the church had stood smoldered for 3 days, the blackened ground refusing to cool. No grass grew there, no birds landed near it, and even the wind seemed to avoid the area. Marta tried to return to normal life, tending to her herb garden and preparing remedies for the townsfolk. But sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the creature's face, its hollow, endless eyes, its jagged teeth, the way its voice had seemed to crawl inside her mind. And then there were the dreams. They began a week after the church's destruction. At first, they were vague and disjointed. Flashes of twisted landscapes, endless corridors of black stone, and faint whispers in a language she didn't understand. But as the nights passed, the dreams grew clearer, more vivid. She saw a door, massive and ancient, carved with the same symbols that had adorned the walls of the church. It stood in the middle of a vast void, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. And behind the door, something waited. On the 10th night after the church burned, the dream stopped. Marta woke in a cold sweat, the silence in her small home pressing down on her like a weight. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself it was over. But then she heard it, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable, the tolling of a bell. Her heart clenched. She sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the deep, resonant chime of the church bell. It was sharper, more urgent, like an alarm. She threw on her coat and stepped outside. The town was dark, the streets empty. But as she stood there, the sound of the bell grew louder, echoing through the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then she saw it. At the edge of town, near the road that led into the forest, a figure stood. It was tall and thin, its form shrouded in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, a pale, sickly yellow. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stared at her. "Marta," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The sound was in her head, as clear as her own thoughts. She stumbled back, her breath hitching. "Oh, what are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, the motion unnaturally slow. "You opened the door," it said. "You broke the seal." Marta shook her head, her heart pounding. "No," she said. "I stopped it. The church is gone. The creature is dead." The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You destroyed its cage," it said. But it was never alone. The air grew colder, the shadows around the figure deepening. Marta took another step back, her mind racing. Before she could react, the figure raised one spindly arm and pointed toward the forest. "They're coming," it said. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Animals returned to the town, but they were wrong. Emaciated, with patches of fur missing and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. The air grew heavier, and the smell of rot seemed to cling to everything. People began to disappear again. It started with the blacksmith, a burly man named Jacob, who had been one of the few to express relief after the church's destruction. His wife found their home empty one morning, the door wide open and a trail of bloody footprints leading out into the woods. Then it was the schoolteacher, Miss Eliza. Her students arrived to find the classroom empty, the blackboard covered in strange, spidery symbols that no one could decipher. By the end of the week, 6 people were gone. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces pale and drawn. "This is your doing," one man shouted at Marta, his voice trembling with fear and anger. "You said it was over. You said we were safe." Marta didn't respond. She couldn't. The truth was she didn't know what was happening. She had thought the nightmare ended when she destroyed the church, but now it was clear that the creature's death had only unleashed something far worse. The bell began to toll again that night. When the townsfolk woke the next morning, they found something waiting for them. At the edge of the crater where the old church had stood, a new structure had appeared. It was smaller, less grand than the original, but it radiated the same malevolent energy. Its walls were made of black stone, slick with moisture, and its single window was shaped like a jagged, staring eye. The door stood open, and from within came the sound of chanting, low, guttural voices that didn't belong to anything human. The Soulless were back, and this time, they weren't alone. The sight of the new church chilled Marta to her core. The dark structure stood silent, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it. The sound of faint chanting drifted out, a whispering tide that crept under her skin and settled in her bones. The townsfolk, too terrified to approach, clustered at a distance, their eyes darting between the church and Marta. "You brought this," someone muttered, their voice sharp with blame. "You tore the veil." Marta ignored them. Blame wouldn't save anyone now. She gripped her machete, still stained with black quire, and took a deep breath. She knew what had to be done. Whatever had emerged in the aftermath of the first church's destruction, whatever had crawled through the door she had supposedly opened, was now taking root here. And it had to be stopped. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice low but resolute. "I'll end this." The crowd murmured nervously, but no one tried to stop her. They were too afraid. Even the bravest among them wouldn't dare step closer to that cursed place. As Marta approached the new church, the chanting grew louder. The voices sounded wrong, layered, as if dozens of throats were speaking in unison. The closer she got, the heavier the air became. Breathing felt like inhaling smoke, and her skin prickled as though something unseen was watching her from every angle. The door creaked open wider as she neared, as if inviting her in. A cold wind gusted out, carrying the stench of rot and decay. Marta hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The interior of the new church was impossibly vast, far larger than it should have been. Shadows danced on walls that stretched upward into darkness, their movements unnatural and deliberate. The floor was slick with a black, tar-like substance that oozed between the cracks in the stone. At the far end of the room stood another altar, similar to the one in the original church, but pulsing with faint, greenish light. The choir within the basin swirled violently, as though alive, and above it hovered a new figure. This one was even worse than the creature she had faced before. Its form was constantly shifting, its edges blurring, as if it couldn't fully exist in this reality. Its many faces, each grotesque and screaming silently, melded into one another in a horrific tapestry of agony. Its eyes, thousands of them, opened and closed across its body, each one radiating malice. "You've come," it said, its voice filling the space. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I knew you would." Marta tightened her grip on the machete. "You're the one behind this," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. The creature laughed, a sound that made the walls tremble. "I am merely the herald," it said, "the first to step through the door you so graciously opened. More will follow." "No," Marta said, her voice hard. "You won't make it out of here." The creature tilted its shifting head. "Do you think you can kill me with that little blade?" it sneered. "Do you even understand what I am?" Marta didn't answer. Instead, she took a step toward the altar, her eyes fixed on the pulsing basin of choir. The creature's gaze followed her movement, and for the first time, it seemed uncertain. "That altar," Marta said slowly, "is your anchor, isn't it? Just like the last one?" The creature roared, its many faces twisting in rage. "You think I'll let you touch it?" it spat. The shadows around the room surged forward, coalescing into grotesque forms that lunged at her. Marta dodged the first shadowy figure, slashing wildly with her machete. The blade met resistance, and the creature dissolved in a black mist, but more were already swarming her. She fought with everything she had, hacking and slicing, her arms burning with effort. The shadows clawed at her, leaving deep gashes on her skin, but she pushed forward. The creature watched, its many eyes glinting with sadistic amusement. "Your struggle is meaningless," it said. "You are one against eternity." But Marta didn't stop. She reached the altar, her hands slick with blood and sweat, and raised the machete high. Before she could strike, the creature lashed out. A tendril of black choir shot forward, wrapping around her wrist and yanking her back. "You will not destroy my heart," the creature roared. The tendril tightened, the choir burning her skin like acid. Marta screamed in pain, but she didn't let go of the machete. With a surge of desperate strength, she wrenched her arm free and plunged the blade into the basin. The choir exploded upward in a violent geyser, drenching her and everything around her. The creature screamed, its form convulsing wildly as cracks spread across its body. "You cannot stop us," it howled, its voice fracturing into 1,000 echoes. "The door is open. The end is inevitable." The altar shattered, the choir evaporating into thick black smoke. The creature collapsed in on itself, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Marta staggered out of the church, her body battered and broken. The structure behind her crumbled, collapsing into the ground as if it had never been there. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as she emerged, covered in blood and choir, but alive. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's done." But as she looked out at their faces, she saw no relief, only fear. They were staring at something behind her. Marta turned slowly. In the distance, beyond the smoldering crater, faint lights flickered in the forest. They weren't fireflies or lanterns. They were torches, moving steadily toward the town. And with them came a sound, the faint tolling of a bell. Her blood ran cold. The creature's words echoed in her mind once more. "The door is open. The end is inevitable." And as the first figures emerged from the treeline, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadow, Marta realized the truth. She hadn't won. She had only delayed the inevitable. The Soulless were coming.